Tucked away in the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 21, is an obscure and not often referred to story of a woman who is rarely mentioned among the women of the Bible. Many books have been written profiling the attributes of female characteristics and characters, but few mention her name. Her story is not told, especially on Mother's Day. Perhaps it is not told because it is an unpleasant one. It is very unpleasant and very unsettling. The story begins with a famine of unusual severity in the land of Israel. God had promised Israel great prosperity, but the famine of drought and deprivation had continued for 3 consecutive years. David, who was the king at the time, for some reason did not inquire on this matter until almost at the end of the 3rd year. He finally recognized it as a divine discipline and sought good reason for it. Sought God for the reason. And the Lord answered, "It is because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites." Well, what is that all about? He learned that the famine was the result of Saul and his blood-stained house. Saul's crime was that he had killed the Gibeonites. Not only had he killed them, he tried to exterminate them in his misguided zeal. In so doing, he had broken a covenant that had been made 400 years prior between Joshua and the Gibeonites. And that's found in Joshua 9, verses 3 through 27. The Gibeonites deceived Joshua into making a covenant before God. And that deception occurred because Joshua did not inquire of the Lord. One of the provisions of the covenant was that the Israelites would let them live so that wrath would not fall on them. Saul, Israel's first king, he violated that covenant. And God is very, very serious. He takes covenant very seriously. David, Israel's 2nd king, determined to right the wrong of Saul. So he called for the Gibeonites to discuss the matter with them. And they just reiterated the covenant to David that the Israelites had sworn to spare them, but they had not, but Saul had not. So David, wanting to rectify the situation and pursue reconciliation, he asked the Gibeonites whether there was anything he could do to make amends or to atone for this wrong. Here we see David making the same mistake as Joshua 400 years before to these ancestors of the Gibeonites. He did not seek God's counsel. David basically said, "Whatever you say, I will do." The Gibeonites did not ask for gold or silver. They became very specific and uncompromising in their demand. Their desire for vengeance concerned one man, Saul, and since he was dead, they focused on Saul's descendants. Nothing would compensate for the wrong Saul had done to them, nothing short of multiple deaths. So they requested the death of 7 of Saul's male descendants. They asked that they be delivered to them and be hung before the Lord at Saul's birthplace. David's words to the Gibeonites, "Whatever you say I will do," must have reverberated within him as he wished he could retract them. Their demand probably jolted him and caused him to remember his oath before the Lord, the covenant he had sworn with Saul's son Jonathan, to spare this Mephibosheth, who was the son of Jonathan. Now, I believe at this time that Jonathan was already in David's home, but he did not mention Jonathan's son to the Gibeonites. And he gave them the two sons of Saul's concubine, and her name is Rizpah. And he gave them, they wanted 7 of Saul's descendants. He gave them 5 of Saul's grandsons. It is at this point that we meet Rizpah, the concubine. We usually don't think in terms of, we don't meditate on the lives of concubines. People are people with human feelings just like us. They have desires, hopes, they love their children just like us. The 7 were killed by the Gibeonites and exposed before the Lord on a hill where they could be easily seen. Hanging was a symbol of being cursed by God, and failure to provide proper burial, usually within 24 hours, was a grievous insult both to the deceased and to the family. It is at this time that we meet this remarkable woman, Rizpah, and we participate in some way to this tragedy and the extraordinary love and endurance that she exhibits. Bereft of 2 sons, she erected a tent nearby. She spread out sackcloth, which is a sign of mourning and overwhelming grief. She spread this sackcloth off on a rock, and she stayed day and night to keep watch over the bodies, to scare away the birds of prey, to scare away the wild animals. She had no support group. This would have been a front page news in every newspaper. It would have made the lead story on every cable network. But there was no cable network. She had no followers on social media. She had no followers on Twitter and Facebook. Nonetheless, Rizpah refused to leave the exposed bodies of her sons and the 5 victims. The latter part of verse 10 tells of her activity during these months of agony. This is a heartbreaking, unimaginable, and unparalleled scene. Rizpah sat on the top of this hill where the bodies of her sons and Saul's grandsons lay. From the beginning of the harvest until rain fell on them from the heavens. That's in verse 10. About 5 or 6 months, depending on which commentary you read. In her deep anguish, and while she mourned, she fought off the vultures and wild beasts, preventing them from eating their bodies. Who of us can take in the depth of her pain, of her grief, and her anguish? The strength and power of a mother's love is what carried her through all of this. When a mother is challenged, especially when it comes to her children, there's a courage that emerges from the depth of her being that is otherworldly. This is given only by the wisdom and the grace of our God. So we can never underestimate the power of a mother's love. Finally, King David, was told of Rizpah's vigil, and perhaps of her desire to make sure that the remains of Saul's 7 descendants be given proper burial. As I had said, in this culture, this was a disgrace. When David heard of her long and hard vigil, he undoubtedly identified with her because he had been a shepherd. Also, David must have been conscience-stricken by her example. He was reminded that he had never retrieved the bones of Saul and Jonathan. He made a 50-mile journey to retrieve their bones. This journey was about 50 miles, and David made that journey himself. The citizens of that Jabesh Gilead had just buried the bones of the king and the king's son under a tree. David now gives Saul and Jonathan an honorable burial. Rizpah's moving display of deep maternal love so moves David that the bones of Saul's sons and grandsons were now gathered up and properly buried along with the bones of Saul and Jonathan in the family sepulcher. They had a final resting place. And verse 14 ends stating, after that, God answered prayer in behalf of the land. There are many, many lessons in this short story that is told in 14 verses. Too many lessons to state in this short message. As we see violence, we see revenge, we see retribution, we see neglect, we see leaning to our own understanding and not inquiring of God, violating covenants and remembering covenants. But today, we are remembering Rizpah. She reaches through the millennia to show us what one person can do, the power of one. She convicts my heart. What does the example of this extraordinary woman say to you today? What does it say to us today? She was not only concerned for her children, but for the children of others. This woman, who was marginalized and powerless, acted selflessly with uncommon love, strength, and determination on behalf of others. And she got results. She exhibited a love that suffers long, a love that endures all things, a love that never fails, a love, like King Solomon tells us, a love that is as strong as death. Rizpah lived out and leaves us the powerful legacy of what God's love looks like. How is her life relevant for us today? Our youth is at risk. The wild animals, the beasts of prey, the vultures, the jackals, the hyenas, the birds of prey of darkness of our culture are seeking to devour our youth through opioids, every kind of addiction, substance abuse, mind melding. They want your children's mind. Gender neutrality, pornography, suicide. And among gifted children, the suicide rates are astounding. I've asked myself, do I have the tenacity and in vigilant prayer for our children. Prayer is one of the most effective and powerful weapons in our arsenal. Pastor Worley spoke a few weeks ago on the power of intercession, and that we are priests who represents the people of God. So as Rizpah intervened for her relatives, let us intercede not only for our children, but for our entire generation.